Nick Palmer is my guest, and there's a second volume of music by Arnold Rosner, who died at a far too young age. And there's lots of music that has yet to be recorded. I know you put out a first volume years ago. How did this second volume come about?
Well, I did a recording of his music about 18 years ago with the Owensboro Symphony and the Altoona Symphony in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, respectively. And that was really picked up well by public radio stations and aficionados. But after he died, they decided to really do a serious push to have as much orchestral music that he'd written as possible recorded by the finest orchestras that they could find. So the volume 1 was done 2 years ago with the London Philharmonic. This is the second volume, and then the third volume will follow shortly. And the money that's being used to fund the project is money from his estate. And we have all kinds of really great people working on this project. Carson Kuhlman, who is a composer in residence at Harvard University, is doing all of the manuscript editions, and they are beautifully engraved and ready for orchestras to use to perform, which is great. So this is kind of our mission in a kind of a I don't know, just, an opportunity to show everybody what we have to offer. And we're already getting several orchestras interested. The London Philharmonic that recorded these CDs is interested in premiering several of these pieces, and several other orchestras are as well. The second one, Volume 2, the one I was initially involved in September, probably has the most complex music yet of Arnold Rosner's. And it's music that the estate really wanted to make sure they had the right performers lined up to do it, especially the right orchestra and the right soloists and all of that. So this second volume has some really, really amazing pieces like the 5 koans, which are basically the definition of koan is it's a Japanese riddle. Each one of them has a little bit of a question and answer to it. They're all so creatively orchestrated for large orchestra, but harken back to the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, as well as 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century orchestral sound and orchestration.
I love these, and the titles are very evocative, and I think go so incredibly well with the music.
Yeah, each one of them is amazing. From the extremely subtle but very difficult music of stillness to music of changes, which is the first koan, just really remarkable stuff. And then we have the Unraveling Dances on this CD, which is another piece that is just so creatively and intelligently laid out. It's kind of a riff on Ravel's Bolero, but instead of it being in the same meter the whole time, which would be 3/4 time, the meter changes in every new section. So it starts, in 3/4, and then it goes to 5/8, and then it goes to 6/8 and 7/8. It goes all the way up to 13/8 before it ends. And every single section has a completely different feel and mood. One sounds like, crumb horns from the 12th century, and then the next one sounds like, Brahms, and then the next one sounds like Hindemith. So it's really crazy, but it's all based on the composer's own heart arrhythmia that he wanted to put into music. So, that's a pretty unusual and groundbreaking thing right there.
Yeah, it's very creative. I love the idea that, it sort of has this, very large crescendo that, as you see, but also very creative. There are all sorts of little elements that some composers have tapped into, but this sort of juxtaposition and combination is magical.
It really is. And, brilliant music always is new, but it always harkens back to something that we already know. And that's what the resonance is here. You hear and you feel things that are somewhat familiar, but everything is completely new. And then the last piece on the CD is The Parable of the Law, which is based on a text by Kafka, which I believe is from The Castle, his great novel. And it is kind of terrorizing, the whole thing, because it's just this, typical Kafka. Doesn't have a very good ending to it, but the drama that's built up around this man trying to figure out if he's going to be entering this door or not, and then finding out at the end that he can't. It's a very subtle thing, but the tension is just sustained over 22 minutes in an amazing way, with a really fabulous baritone soloist, Christopher Burchett, who's actually been recently living at in attending IU. Actually, his wife's getting a doctorate at IU. He's been living in the Bloomington area and then making recordings all over the world, but a really great voice.
I wanted to ask about working with the London Philharmonic because there's a great history there, and I know that it was at the Abbey Road studio. So I guess there's probably two questions here about working with the London Philharmonic and recording in that magical space.
Yeah, well, all I can say is it was kind of like a dream. It started on a Monday morning, and we had 4 full days of recording sessions, and then we did about 4 days of post-production. And I was basically in heaven the whole time. It was just amazing. Just staying in a beautiful old hotel where Sigmund Freud used to live, and then walking every day through the beautiful streets of London to the Abbey Road studios, and then arriving there and watching all the tourists trying to get their picture taken on the crosswalk, and then being the fortunate ones that were allowed to go in the gate while everyone else was clamoring to get in. You just feel like a king. And the orchestra itself, I just had no idea what to expect. I've conducted a lot of major orchestras, but of all the major orchestras I've ever conducted, this was by far the most congenial, cooperative, collegial, and just friendly group that they really wanted to do a terrific job. And part of that is that these orchestras are self-governed in Britain, so they have to make a decision if this is a project they want to take on. And they unanimously voted, we want to do this project. And so the individuals all bought into it. And I insisted, and they hadn't done this before, but I insisted that everyone who performed was listed on the liner notes. Because there are some just amazing solos, and I want people to know who did these, because these are legendary players in that group that like if you're a timpanist, Simon Corrington, who's going to be playing, or whatever, these different people are just amazing. And they would, at the break, they would stop and they'd come over and say, Maestro, would it be possible to hear my take? I want to make sure I didn't mess anything up. And we'd go in the booth and hear it, and he would decide, which of the 5 takes we were going to do based on, but they were given the music the day of. Nobody had the music in advance, and by the second take, they had it nailed. And this is really difficult music. So it was quite an exciting experience.
In the cinema world, a director might film 2 movies at the same time. I know that the upcoming Marvel Avengers is going to have, release the movie here, but they've already filmed the second part. And there's sort of a continuation. I think it's lovely that in this series of 4 days of recording and then coming back with pickups and whatnot, that this was sort of in the same line, I think, that you've recorded 2 incredible albums. The first one is already out. The next one's coming out.
Right. And that was a lot of work. I mean, and interestingly enough, too, we, took a lot of time. In the United States, you wouldn't even be allowed to have a 3.5 hour service because, for union rules. But there, they just decide how much they want to work. So every single day was 7 hours of recording, 6.5 to 7 hours of recording. And you take a 10-minute break. That's it. Just enough for a spot of tea, and you're right back in again. And again, you'd asked about the Abbey Road studio. What an amazing place. Every single studio's got a little different size and configuration. There's Studio 3 where the Beatles recorded, and we had a private tour. And then we were in Studio 1, which was the studio where the London Symphony recorded all the Star Wars music, and the London Philharmonic recorded all of the Lord of the Rings scores. But people like Herbert von Karajan and Carlo Maria Giulini and, as far back as, Thomas Beecham and Adrian Bolt recorded with London orchestras in that space. So you could just feel the energy in there. And then using all of those really beautiful old Neumann microphones from the 40s and 50s that it's funny because they were going to sell them all. They came to the microphone locker manager, who's still there. He's been there like 60 years, and said, let's give you new microphones. He said, no way, I'm not selling anything. And now they have these mics that are worth $80,000 that are, those really big mics that you see, late night hosts have on their desks. Those are the mics that we used. And the sound that they achieve is unbelievable.
Nick Palmer has a lovely volume 2 of Arnold Rosner's music. And I wanted to ask, because I've talked to folks like Libby Larson, who sometimes talk about languages being different for orchestras that normally might play Brahms and Beethoven, but might not play as much Ellington or, newer music with different accents. And also the idea that it used to be when you were in Paris, you recognize the, reeds being a little different, and if you were in Russia, you'd notice sort of the strings or the 100 violins of the Philadelphia Orchestra, 100 strings of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I think these days the playing has sort of risen, that there's a lot more. It's a little harder to tell if you're in Moscow or Paris or London with the players, because there's just such an incredible virtuosity. But I was curious, as you were talking about, the players getting it this day, I imagine that's a lot of pressure on you to convey Arnold's intentions, and working with Carson, I imagine, over these scores to look and try to get the results that you want.
Yes, and it took an awful lot of preparation time for me. I think I spent, over 200 hours preparing over the summer to do this. But it's interesting because a friend of mine who conducted the London Philharmonic several years ago told me it's the difference between driving a Toyota Avalon and driving a Ferrari or something. What happens is the sensitivity. You can do tiny little things with your fingertips that they'll figure out, which means if the conductor has a really good idea of what they want, and then, of course, we spend a lot of time talking with the producer and then later with the engineer about what they want, and the producer has certain ideas about how he wants the music to come off, and then in the final analysis, as much as what I'm doing is important, the engineer in the booth, who's hearing exactly what's coming out, and I'm not hearing it exactly the same way he is, has to make the final tweak about what needs to be done in the session to maximize the time. So it's part me rehearsing and part the engineer figuring all that out. But in terms of the sound, the thing that's amazing about an orchestra like the London Phil is that they can pretty much do whatever you want them to do. They have a Russian conductor right now, and he is trying to impart a particular type of Russian style, which, is very, heavy on vibrato with the strings, and a certain bowing style, which is very uniquely Russian. But when they play the different musics, they adapt really, really well. But they still retain those classic British things like, that lovely oboe sound, because they make reeds differently there, or clarinet playing with vibrato or something. These are things that are very typically British, and when you hear it, you can pretty much tell it's probably a British orchestra.
Yeah. I guess I'd end asking, I know, having lost composer friends, and, we all think about, oh gosh, if we could add 5 years to Mozart's life or Schubert's life, that it's probably a nice feeling to record music by a composer who's no longer with us and letting that music live on. Is it one of those things to go, yeah, I'm helping this legacy, I'm part of this?
Yeah, it really is, and it's an exciting part of it, because when I did the first CD with him 15 years ago, obviously he was still alive and he was there for everything, and I know what he wanted more than anything else was for his music to live on eternally through the beautiful construction of all of these beautifully edited scores that orchestral performers can use, and for the public through these really, really, really high quality CDs that really allows the music to shine the way the composer intended. And that's what it's all about, is really bringing his message to the people through great parts for orchestras to perform with, and even more importantly, beautifully done recordings that everybody really bought into on many levels to make as good as they possibly could be.
Well, congratulations on this second volume. We're looking
Thank
forward
you.
to the third and a lot more.
Thanks, John.